love the way John sings. He doesn't need a microphone. Welcome to another week where we have been looking at the faith of God's people in the book of Genesis. And fortunately or unfortunately, this is the last week that I'm with you this year. And I just want to kind of remind you about the journey that we have taken. This is a series that started earlier in the year, much earlier than just a few weeks ago. Earlier in the year, we looked at the first individuals in the book of Genesis and their faith. We looked at the faith of Adam and Eve. We looked at the faith of Abel, of Seth, of Enoch, and of Lamech. In Adam, we learned that faith believes what God says, particularly what God promises. In Eve, we learned that faith credits God with the workings out of his promises. In Abel, we learned that faith understands that a sacrifice is required in order to re-enter into the presence of God. In Seth, we learned that faith calls upon a God with a name, using his name, whose name is Yahweh. In Enoch, we learned that faith walks with God. And when we walk with God, we overcome death. In Lamech, we learned that faith hopes for rest in a son, the final son, who is Jesus Christ. And over the last 5 weeks, we picked up where we left off earlier in the year, and we looked at the faith of another 5 individuals in the book of Genesis. In week 1, we looked at the faith of Noah. In Noah, we learned that faith understands that rest is not achieved when we work. Rest is achieved when God completes his work. In week 2, we looked at the faith of Shem and Japheth. In Shem and Japheth, we learned that faith honors authority, even when we have seen the shame. In week 3, we looked at the faith of Abraham, and we learned that faith waits, and waiting obtains the promises of God. In week 4, we looked at the faith of Lot. And in Lot, we learned that faith understands that even when we have a faith like Lot's, weak and little, it is still a faith that will deliver us. And in week 5, last week, we started looking at the faith of Hagar, Sarah's servant woman, and Ishmael, Hagar's son. And what I wanted us to see and learn in Hagar and Ishmael is that faith understands that God sees us and God hears us. However, last week we were only able to just look at Hagar and how God sees us. We learned last week that after 10 years of sojourning in the land of Canaan, we're reminded by Genesis chapter 16 that Sarah is still barren. She was barren when she was in Ur of the Chaldeans when Abraham married her, and she is still barren now in the land of Canaan. Although Yahweh had promised Abraham that he would have a seed, Sarah has yet to conceive a seed for him. We learned that when Abraham and Sarah first arrived in the land of Canaan, they arrived in a land that could not bear food. And when the land could not bear food, Abraham and Sarah turned to Egypt. And now when Sarah is unable to bear a child, Abraham and Sarah again turn to Egypt, but this time in the form of an Egyptian servant woman, one of Sarah's Egyptian slaves. And that slave is none other than Hagar. And so, believing that Yahweh had shut her womb forever, Sarah devises a plan. She comes up with a way for her to have a seed using Hagar. This plan consists of 4 steps. Step 1, Hagar will marry Abraham. Step 2, Abraham will go into Hagar. Step 3, Hagar will conceive. And step 4, Hagar will give her seed to me. And so she tells Abraham her plan. And like Adam, who listened to the voice of his wife, Abraham listens to the voice of his wife. Like Eve, who took the fruit and gave it to her husband Adam, Sarah takes Hagar and gives her to her husband Abraham. Abraham goes into Hagar, and Hagar conceives. So far, so good, right? Step 1, done. Step 2, done. Step 3, done. But how about step 4? Well, things don't go according to Sarah's plan. Having conceived, Hagar realizes that although she is Abraham's second wife, she is Abraham's greater wife. And Sarah, although she is Abraham's first wife, she is now the lesser wife. And Sarah realizes it too. Her plan was to be built up by Hagar, but now she is being knocked down. Like Eve, who did what was good in her sight, Sarah does what is good in her sight. And she afflicts Hagar. We learned last week that just 14 verses earlier, God said to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, verse 13, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years." And because we have read past the book of Genesis, all the way into the book of Exodus, we know that what God is talking about here is about Israel's affliction, Israel's slavery, and Israel's sojourning in Egypt. But yet, the first person in redemptive history to sojourn in a foreign land, the first person who is a slave, the first person who is afflicted is Hagar. And only 14 verses afterward. The proximity is uncanny. You see, before Israel experiences their slavery, before Israel experiences their sojourning in a foreign land, before Israel experiences their affliction at the hands of Egypt, it is an Egyptian who experiences all of it first at the hands of Abraham and Sarah. What does this mean? It means that before Israel is Israel, Hagar is Israel. She is the first of Israel. Like Israel, she would flee from her affliction and slavery. Like Israel, she would wander in the wilderness. Like Israel, she would be found by Yahweh at a well. Like Israel, she would have 12 sons and her son Ishmael. And as the first of Israel, Hagar becomes a woman of many firsts. First, she is the first person in all of history, redemptive history, to whom the angel of Yahweh first appeared. Yes, before this, Yahweh did appear to Abraham, but it is never said that the angel of Yahweh appears to Abraham. The angel of Yahweh doesn't appear to Abraham until Abraham offers his son Isaac as a sacrifice. Second, she is the first and only woman in all of redemptive history to receive the promise of the multiplication of seed. Genesis chapter 16, verse 10. Moreover, the angel of Yahweh said to her, "I will greatly multiply your seed, so they will be too many to be counted." Abraham was also promised the multiplication of seed. But before it was said to Abraham, it was first said to Hagar. Third, she is the first woman in all of redemptive history to receive the annunciation of a child, the first. Genesis chapter 16, verse 11. And the angel of Yahweh said to her further, "Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael." Luke chapter 1, verse 31. And the angel said to her, "Behold, you will conceive in your womb, and you will bear a son, and you shall name him," who? Jesus. Before Mary received an annunciation from an angel, Hagar received it first. And so, what does Hagar learn from this ordeal, from her affliction, from her slavery, from her sojourning? She learns that although she is a woman, although she is a slave, although she is a sojourner, although she is afflicted, she is seen by Yahweh. Hagar is given in redemptive history as a lesson to Israel in their sojourning, in their slavery, in their affliction, that in the same way Yahweh saw Hagar, a person whom nobody else saw as being anything other than useful for her body, Yahweh would see them. Hagar is also a lesson to us in our own sojourning, in our own affliction, that Yahweh sees us too, even when it feels like nobody else does. Can I ask you a question? You know, all of us knew about Hagar before this lesson. But how many of us saw Hagar? How many of us saw her for anything more than just another random person in redemptive history that happens to be mentioned? Thank God that we're not left to our own eyes and that God sees us. Today, I want us to continue looking at Hagar and Ishmael, and I want us to turn our attention more closely to Ishmael, Hagar's son. In Ishmael, I want us to learn that faith understands that not only does God see us, God also hears us. And where does this lesson come from? It comes from the very annunciation that was given to Hagar. Genesis chapter 16, verse 11. Let me read it to you again, and let me add the last phrase. And the angel of Yahweh said to her further, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh has heard your affliction. Ishmael's name means God will hear. Who will he hear? He will hear Ishmael. And today I want us to take a look at that in Genesis chapter 21, verses 6 through 21. Genesis chapter 21, verses 6 through 21. Let me read it to you. I'm sorry, verses 5 through 21. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing in jest. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maidservant and her son. The son of this maidservant shall not be an heir with my son, with Isaac. And the matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. So God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and your maidservant. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice. For through Isaac your seed shall be named. And the son of the maidservant I will make a nation also, because he is your seed. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the child and sent her away. So she went and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was finished, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away. For she said, "Do not let me see when the child dies." And she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. Then God heard the voice of the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Arise, lift up the boy, and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and was an archer. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So we come now to a portion that focused significantly on Ishmael's life. 14 years have now passed since the birth of Ishmael. Remember that Abraham had Ishmael when he was 86 years old. And now, in verse 5, when he is 100 years old, he now has Isaac. Verse 5, now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. So Ishmael now is significantly older. Right? Many years have passed by. Listen to what Sarah says now that Isaac is born in verse 6. And Sarah said, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me." And she said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." What kind of laughter is Sarah talking about? What do you think? Is this good laughter? Is it the sarcastic laughter when the telemarketer calls you on your phone and says, "Hey, I have a deal for you. It's a timeshare," or "it's whole life insurance," and you go, "Aha," you know. This is the laughter of joy, the laughter of happiness. And what does she say? She says that everyone will laugh with me when they hear that I have borne Abraham a child. But there's also a kind of hidden meaning in this verse. When Sarah says that God has made laughter for me, she's not just talking about making her laugh. God has literally made laughter for her, because Isaac's name means the one who laughs. His name means laughter. Isn't that beautiful? So she predicts that everyone who hears of this child's birth will laugh with me. Now take a look at what happens in verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And Abraham saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing in jest. So to wean is to remove from breastfeeding. It's usually a term we use for animals, but here it's being used for people. So I don't have children. So I don't know how long children breastfeed. So can anybody tell me how long that usually lasts? About a year?
But back then, it lasted a longer period of time.
Yeah, so maybe it lasts a longer period of time. So how much longer?
It could have been up to 5 years.
Yeah. Who said unfortunately?
14 by now? Oh, you're talking about Isaac being weaned. Oh, okay, never mind.
Oh yeah, Isaac is being weaned. Yeah, I think it would be 13 years is maybe too long to be breastfeeding. Okay, it's just to give you a time reference. So maybe a year or a few years have passed by now that Isaac has been weaned. And so although Sarah predicts that everyone who sees this child will laugh with her, what happens in verse 9? She sees someone laughing. Who does she see laughing? She sees Ishmael. Well, we know that for some reason, this doesn't give her joy because she would want to drive out Ishmael and Hagar after this. So what kind of laughter is this? What kind of laughter is Sarah seeing? Ishmael is not the first person in redemptive history to laugh. Does anybody know who the first person to laugh is in redemptive history?
Wasn't it Sarah herself laughing at what God said about the announcement?
Close?
No.
Close? She's the second.
Abraham.
Very good. It was Abraham. Abraham laughs in Genesis chapter 17, verse 17. Let's take a look at that. Genesis chapter 17, verse 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a son? What kind of laughter is this? It's the laughter of disbelief. It's the laughter that he cannot believe the promise that God had given him, that a seed would literally come from his own flesh and from Sarah's flesh. Now, Scott, you said the second person to laugh was Sarah, and that's correct. That's in Genesis chapter 18, verse 2. Oh, sorry, 12. I can't memorize everything. Genesis chapter 18, verse 12. And Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? What kind of laughter is this? Is it joy? It's also disbelief. Abraham laughs in disbelief. Sarah laughs in disbelief. Her son is born, predicts that everyone will laugh with joy. And then she sees Ishmael laughing. What kind of laughing does Ishmael have?
Mocking.
It's the mocking laughter. It's also the laughter of disbelief.
Well, I don't think so. I think mocking is different. I mean, what's there to not believe? The kid's right there. You know what I mean? I mean, he sees.
You make a very good point, and I will tell you what Ishmael does not believe. But you make a very good point. What is it that Ishmael does not believe about Isaac? Isaac is there, right? He's physically there. He's alive. He's been alive for the last something years, probably. He's weaned. He can now eat solid food and whatnot. So is it that Ishmael laughs because Isaac is not real? Or is it that Ishmael laughs because he has a hard time believing that Isaac is the true seed?
I'd suggest that was a mocking laugh, and I think it was based on a threat. I think that prior to Isaac showing up, Ishmael was quite content that he was going to be the recipient of.
And you are correct. And you are correct, Steve.
Abraham's, everything, and that it was one of those nervous,
It is.
violent laughs. And I don't think that there was humor in it. I think it was a threat. And I think that, I think it's important to make a distinction that I believe that Ishmael received collateral blessing from Abraham, that he wasn't really the intended one. The laughter was Sarah's, the hearing was Hagar's, but I don't see any indication, maybe I'm wrong, I don't see any indication that Isaac laughed, and I don't see any indication that Ishmael heard.
Right, right. And you are correct, Steve. And we will get into a little bit of what Steve has said about Ishmael believing that he is the seed. And there is reason to suspect that that is true, and that is the case. And yes, you're right. This laughter is not a laughter of joy. Right? This laughter is not a laughter of belief. This laughter is more of the mocking kind of attitude. Right? So now that another seed has come along, and this is the seed that God says will be the one that will carry Abraham's name and not Ishmael. But there's something else that Sarah sees here. And it's not just that Sarah is concerned about Ishmael's attitude of laughter. There is another concern. Right? And that concern is that Ishmael laughs. That he actually laughs. And Steve touched upon this a little bit, right? Ishmael laughs before Isaac laughs. But Isaac's name is laughter. And yet Isaac never laughs in redemptive history. It's Ishmael who laughs. So in other words, before Isaac does what his name indicates he's supposed to do, Ishmael does what Isaac's name is supposed to do. Ishmael laughs. Ishmael is too much like Isaac. And because he is too similar, right, in terms of the action, he has a contention for the inheritance that Isaac has. And Sarah sees this. She sees two sons that will contend for the true inheritance of the seed that Yahweh promises. And so this gives reason for what Sarah says in verse 10. Therefore, she said to Abraham, drive out this maidservant and her son. The son of this maidservant shall not be an heir with my son, with Isaac. And the matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. So God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and your maidservant. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice, for through Isaac your seed shall be named. And of the son and of the maidservant, I will make a nation also, because he is your seed. And so wanting to secure Isaac's inheritance, and this is not abnormal to redemptive history. There are many other women in redemptive history who take measures and actions to secure the inheritance of the true heir of the seed. Who is one other woman you can think of? A little closer to this history. Who's another woman?
Rebecca.
Right. Right. Rebecca with her son, Jacob. So this is what Sarah proposes to Abraham. You must cast out Ishmael so that he will not contend for the true inheritance that belongs to Isaac. And this matter distresses Abraham. But it turns out Sarah is right. Right? How do we know? Because Yahweh tells Abraham to listen to the voice of his wife. First time in history, by the way. First time in history that God tells a man to listen to his wife. It's been 20 generations of mankind. but Sarah is right. This also gives us some indication of what has happened to Sarah up to this point, right? Remember, the first time that a husband listened to the voice of his wife, it was Adam and Eve. It was sinful. The second time that it happens, it's Abraham and Sarah. When Abraham listens to Sarah's proposition with Hagar. But now, for the first time in redemptive history, God tells Abraham to listen to the voice of Sarah, using the same language. Sarah has grown. She has become a better, greater Eve. She is the first woman in redemptive history to say something that will not lead her husband to sin, but to lead her husband to righteousness. So the question is, what did Sarah know that Abraham did not know? What did Sarah learn up until this point that Abraham should have learned in order to not be distressed? And I want to suggest to you this morning that what Sarah learned was that Ishmael must be circumcised. Now you say, Stephen, what are you talking about? You probably say that often. What are you talking about? Because Ishmael was circumcised, right? What I want to suggest to you is that Sarah wanted Ishmael to be circumcised completely. And there is a reason for this. But to understand this, we need to kind of take a step back and review Abraham and Sarah's lives so far. And Steve touched upon this. So remember that when Abraham is 86 years old, he has Ishmael. And then when he is 99 years old, what happens? What does God tell him to do?
Be circumcised?
Right, to circumcise. He's given the right of circumcision. And then God tells him what will happen. What can he expect a year later? A son who is Isaac. Prophecy of Isaac. And then when he is 100 years old, Isaac is born. And Isaac is circumcised when he is 8 days old. And here at 99, he also circumcises Ishmael. So Ishmael is circumcised when he is 13 years old. So who is the son that is born after circumcision? It's Isaac. Who is the son that is born before circumcision? It is Ishmael. And for this time period, for 13 years, God never tells Abraham that Ishmael is not his seed. Not till 13 years later.
But didn't he say that? Maybe I'm mistaken. I thought back in when he said that your seed that it will come through that I'm trying to figure out where that was from.
Yes,
he promised him that one would be coming from, I thought, from Sarah.
you are correct. And that is in Genesis chapter 17.
I thought he said that before then, but maybe he didn't say that before then?
It was in Genesis chapter 17, after the conception of Ishmael. So before then, there's some ambiguity about who the child will come from. And that is why Sarah takes things into her own hands. But it's after God allows that it's further clarified that it actually is going to be from Sarah and not from Hagar. But again, there's this period of time of 13 years where Ishmael is temporarily functioning as Abraham's seed only to be clarified 13 years later that the real seed is Isaac. And that seed is not born of the power of the flesh. So here is the point. Ishmael is the product of accomplishing things by the power of the flesh. Isaac is the product of accomplishing things by the power of promise. You see, Ishmael was conceived with an intact phallus. Isaac was conceived with a mutilated phallus. He is conceived after the cutting off of the flesh, whereas Ishmael was not conceived after the cutting off of the flesh. But Sarah extends this. She applies what she learns, right? That in order to receive promise, we must first cut off any power that we might think comes from the flesh. So she applies it. That means then that what we have accomplished by the power of the flesh must also be cut off. It must be cast out. It must make way for that which God has accomplished by the power of promise. And if you take a look at how Ishmael and Isaac is conceived, you will notice that fleshly terms are used in the conception of Ishmael. It's very descriptive and vivid. Hagar is taken. Abraham goes into Hagar. Hagar conceives. But in the birth of Isaac, it's almost as if nothing happens. Yahweh appears one day and Sarah conceives. And that is the visual point. Sarah is right. Sarah also reminds us of another woman who advises a great man about a matter of something that needs to be cut off. Do you remember who?
Moses, right?
You're correct. Zipporah. She advises him rightly that Moses did not circumcise his son. So she had to do it for him. And she was correct. She was correct. Sarah learns that the son who is accomplished by the power of the flesh must be cut off. And this makes way for what is spoken of in Isaiah chapter 54 and in Galatians chapter 4. The allegory that Paul alludes to and that is found in Isaiah chapter 54. That those that are the sons of the power of the flesh must be cut off. But those that are the sons of the power of promise inherit the kingdom of God. But what is unusual is that Paul is talking to people who are not circumcised. They literally were born with intact phalluses, and yet he tells them that they are the true, real sons of promise.
Is that because of the new covenant then? Because of Jesus?
Right, because a greater flesh has been cut off. And it's not required that your flesh be cut off. Hey, people are getting ahead of me today. But it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Because I want to get to what you're about to say. Or what you just said. Take a look with me with the rest of this passage. Let me just read it to you, okay? And we'll make a few quick points about it. So in verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the child and sent her away. So she went and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was finished, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away. For she said, "Do not let me see when the child dies." And she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. Then God heard the voice of the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Arise, lift up the boy, and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness and was an archer. Now notice who God heard. God heard Ishmael. The first time that something comes out of his mouth is what? It's laughter and mockery. The second time something comes out of his mouth, crying. The first time Sarah hears laughter. The second time God hears crying. God hears Ishmael. But notice who God hears. God hears the son that is born by the power of the flesh. God hears the son who is cut off. God saves that son from death. Now later, another son would be saved from death. Who is that son? It's Isaac. And in a very similar manner to that of Ishmael. Abraham wakes up early in the morning, but instead of putting things on Hagar, he puts things on a donkey. Takes Ishmael up. Ishmael comes near death. Yahweh appears to Abraham and saves Ishmael. Saves Isaac. But before Isaac is saved, who is saved? Ishmael is saved. Do you see that? The children born outside of circumcision are saved. But later in history, there would be a son, a promised son, born and was circumcised, but he would be cast out. Literally, he would be cast out of the city of Jerusalem, not to die in a bush like Ishmael, but to die on a tree. He too would thirst, but he would be given no water, but sour drink. He too would cry, but he would not be heard. He is the greater son of promise. Even though he was a son of promise, he was cast out so that the sons of flesh, you and me, might become the sons of promise. I know we're running late, but with that, we come to the last week that I'm with you today, fortunately or unfortunately. I hope that the lessons that I've shared with you have been helpful to you. And I want to thank you for being a wonderful people to teach. You're much easier to teach than the 400 lecture hall students that come in the morning barely awake, okay? You've been really kind, very charitable. And these lessons are lessons from my own life, and I hope that they'll be edifying to you and encouraging to you and to your children. Remember, not all of us have been privileged to have been born in Christian families with examples of parents and grandparents. What I want to suggest to you in this series is that you have a Christian family, and it goes all the way back to the beginning in the book of Genesis, and you can learn from them too. Let us pray. Lord, we thank you for the saints of your kingdom. Lord, we're sorry that maybe we overlooked some of them, but we ask that you give us eyes to see. Open our eyes like you opened Hagar's eyes to see the water that was next to her. Open our eyes now to see the Son that is next to us, the Son who has already come. Help us to meditate and reflect on that. Help us to thank you, and we will not need to be cut off because you had to cut off your own Son. Thank you for adopting us into your family, even though we are sojourners in this life. All glory and honor be to your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. you.
Ending the